The work session of the Board of Education for May 19, 2020 is called to order. This meeting is being audio streamed live on channel 28 and will be replayed throughout the next 2 weeks. Please check the district website for replay times. This meeting is also being audio streamed live on our PPS TV services website. Tonight we have an opportunity to have the board provide feedback on some sample resiliency bond scenarios, as well as walk through an exercise using our racial equity and social justice lens together. I believe Dan Young has provided the board with a document that we'll all be working from to provide sort of real-time feedback. Superintendent Guerrero, is there anything you'd like to add before our board School Improvement Bond Chair Andrew Scott kicks us off?
Good evening, directors. No, I think tonight's the continuation of another really important conversation. Anytime we're talking about the allocation of public resources and how they meet our core mission, but in particular for ensuring equitable outcomes for every one of our students. I think tonight's discussion about how we apply an equitable lens as we make important decisions about the direction of potential bond campaign is an important one. And I know that our COO will be a little more clear about the objective he's hoping we satisfy here this evening. But Director Scott, over to you.
Great. Well, I'll be brief as well and turn it over to staff. So in terms of agenda tonight, we're meeting from 6 to 8. As usual, I'd like to see if we can get out of here on time, particularly since it's election night, so there might be some fun things to see after 8 o'clock. The agenda overall today, we're going to spend some time at the beginning talking about sort of just a recap of where we are and resiliency bond options. And again, as we discussed at our last board meeting, the idea of at this time during COVID-19 and with the crisis we're facing, is there interest on the board of pivoting a little bit in terms of what we bring to the voters. We're going to talk through some finance options. We're going to do the exercises that Chair Constam mentioned using the racial equity and social justice lens, and then a board feedback exercise. We'll wrap up then with community engagement overview, next steps. Any questions on the agenda before we dive in? Hearing none, I'm going to turn it over to staff. I think I'm going to Dan, and you're going to help lead us through this session.
That's correct. Good evening, directors and superintendent. So we've got some pretty dense information tonight. Most of it, I will say, is updated information. So especially for board members who are on the School Improvement Bond Committee, a lot of it will be familiar, it will just be updated. So we're going to go through it pretty quick. Please stop me or stop any of us and ask questions as we go along. I think that's a good form, and being this a work session, we can be a little more informal. And the first part is really just to get through some level setting. So once we get into the exercises, people will be largely on the same plane, and we'll look at those exercises pretty efficiently. So with that, I'm going to try and present and then walk through a presentation. I'm getting there. Okay. Can people see my screen?
Yes, we can, Dan.
Wonderful. Okay, here is our agenda for tonight, as we just discussed. The first two, I think we're going to blend together and go through those pretty quickly, and then we'll jump into the exercises and we'll go over the community engagement. Meeting objective. So our next step, we're sort of at the precipice here, is our community engagement efforts for this bond package. So what primarily we're looking for tonight is feedback from the board members that will inform that process. We have three primary questions that we're going to try and get some information about. One is, what's the right size of the bond? What are the board's top priorities? And what specific information would the board like to know from the community as we go through this engagement process? So we'll do a quick recap. We'll do this in like 2 minutes, and then we'll move on from there. So some of the stuff that we have covered to date, We've talked through the district's approved long-range facilities plan. And also we have reviewed our capital financing, our long-term capital financing plans that we have. We've also talked through our previous bonds that have been approved. We've talked through the scope and the criteria that was used to select those scopes of work for those bonds. Educational and facility needs. We recently completed a facility condition assessment earlier this year. We've reviewed that information along with what staff has identified as priorities. At our last meeting, we walked through the educational and facility improvement priorities, I think, quite a bit in depth. We've also talked through some cost data. Our facilities condition assessment gives us hard cost data, and we've walked through that and looked at some ranges for scopes of work. And we've also reviewed the individual high school master plans. We've looked through some staff options. As recent as our last meeting, we even looked at 4 different potential options for a bond scenario. And then our next step is the community input. And all of those are intended to be kind of the key ingredients for us to be able to make an informed decision about the bond and the bond package. So I want to take a minute and define the resiliency bond a little bit. It's something that we've talked about here in the last couple of weeks. And effectively, the resiliency bond is a pivot from the 8-year, $1.4 billion bond that we've been talking about for several months to a smaller and a shorter term bond package. A resiliency bond would include, of course, be shorter duration, would be a smaller amount, but would address high priority district needs. Importantly, it would maintain the existing tax rate, and hopefully it would allow for the economy to recover before we looked at a larger bond a little bit further down the road. Items that I likely wouldn't include would be really large projects, such as our modernization work, or long duration scopes of work, like we were looking at 8 years of roofing improvements on our previous bond. A point to, I think, be very specific about here is a resiliency bond, a shorter term bond, would still maintain this long-term capital plan that we have in place right now. It would just effectively break it up into different segments. So for example, we have been talking about an 8-year bond segment, whereas now we're looking at potentially a 2-year followed by a longer bond, maybe a 6-year bond effort. So visually, I want to share what that might look like. And I apologize, I tried to make this less blurry, but I failed at that. So this is just a sample schedule of what our current bond projects look like and what future bonds could potentially look like from a simple schedule standpoint. You'll see at the top, we have our 2017 bond projects and the rough durations of when those projects will complete. Down right below that in the darker blue, you'll see what we had been discussing was a $1.4 billion bond. That would be in November of this year. And we talked about that as being an 8-year bond. And when we say 8 years, what we mean is we wouldn't target going back out for another bond for 8 years. So we would look for a vote in 2020 and then another vote in 2028. Whereas the resiliency bond doesn't dramatically change that overall capital plan. You'll see down below here, what we're looking at is really front loading some specific high priority scopes of work in this early part of the next handful of years, and then potentially going out again in as early as another 2 years in 2022. And so that for potentially a 6-year bond, there's some decisions that still need to be made there. But in essence, it's taking an 8-year plan and just breaking it into 2 segments. So just wanted to level set a little bit about that and about what the scheduling might look like. And so during our exercise, we might want to come back to this, and we're happy to do that and answer questions. But I thought I'd ask if there's any questions about the schedule, sample schedule. Okay.
Wait, hang on. Sorry, take you off the mute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So if I'm reading this correctly, the assumption is that all of the work started under a 2020 bond, would be completed by the end of 2024, right?
Roughly, it'll depend. It's a great question. It'll depend on what the scope is. We still haven't defined what the scope is. So when we've looked to, and we'll talk about here in a little bit, the different options, we roughly looked at what a 2 to 4 year window would be. So completing all the work within 2 to 4 years. It's possible something could go a little bit longer. For example, if we did security improvements and the scope of those improvements took us 5 years, well, that would be fine to complete that over that 5 year period. But generally, we're looking 2, 3, or 4 years.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
And I guess one other clarifying point is, what's hopefully somewhat visual here is, even if those improvements take 3 or 4 years, we can still go out for a bond in 2 years. We just wouldn't sell the bonds necessarily right away. And what happens during the course of these bond efforts is we sell bonds when we need the funds to complete improvements. We don't sell them all.
Also, Dan, is it correct to say that all of that work would be contracted within that shorter time period? Not necessarily completed, which is what you just said, but it would be contracted and budgeted.
Correct. Yes, all the funds we would allocate for the projects, and then we would contract and complete the projects in those time periods. And again, these are just sample timelines, but just want to illustrate of construction might continue longer than 2 years, but we might go out for a bond in 2 years.
So Dan, clarification. Initially you said no roofs, but you had a description of that. But there is, I do see roof and the green tiles here. Can you differentiate between those two? And I have a follow-up question as well.
Sure. I'm not sure I understood the first part. You said initially there was no roofs.
I thought you said when you were saying if we go for a shorter term bond, we wouldn't have, and I think it's on it may be on a previous slide.
Yeah, Dan, you were just saying that there's no long-term roof project, and I think
yeah, exactly.
Bailey's asking the difference between the long-term.
I see. I understand. Sorry. Yeah, that was an example. It wasn't the best example. I guess I was trying to relate back to back in March when we were looking at options. When we were looking at options like roof, which is one of the scopes that's really cyclical. It's something that we know we have a deficit there. So it's something that we target that's a critical infrastructure improvement that we do on a regular basis. So for the resiliency bond here, we're going to propose doing 3 or 4 years of roofs, not 8 years. So the overall amount will be much smaller. So I didn't mean to imply that there would be no roof budget, but just there wouldn't be a very long duration. That makes sense?
It's just you're doing fewer roofs because it's fewer years. Is that
correct?
Okay. Secondly, so money to complete Benson would not be part of this, or would it?
Yes, in all of the scenarios that we're looking at, the funds to complete all the 2017 projects are included as well. So Benson and the multiple pathways. And I think what you're looking at here is you're seeing that Benson multiple pathways are up above in the blue. And from a schedule standpoint, that makes sense. But really, when it comes to the funding, the Benson multiple pathways would be split funded between the resiliency bond and the 2017 bond.
So, and I assume we'll get to some, if we did, for example, a 2-year bond at current tax rate, how much money would that bring in? How much money would go to Benson and multiple pathways, and then what's left over for other projects? I assume we'll get to that.
We will. That is a great segue, which I can go to unless there's other questions.
I have a question also, Dan.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't know how else to raise my hand with Google Hangouts, but Scott, that was also one of my questions was what was the total amount that could be that we're looking at. But the other thing is on a 2-year cycle, if we're going out again in 2022, that the schedule that you are presenting now assumes best case scenario. And I'm wondering if you've compiled a worst case, like financially, in terms of the economy is going to be in really bad shape probably in 2022. And this kind of reflects best case. What are we doing for worst case? Like, do we have any modeling?
So actually, I think we're going to get to that in the finance options, Dan. I don't know if you're doing that or if Claire Hertz is doing that, right? But that's where we're going to walk through all these details in just in a couple minutes in terms of the different options.
Yeah, I'll hit on the finance options here in just a minute, but I will say something specific to schedule. What's something that's nice about this graphic as it's presented is, I don't know, it's a good question what worst case is, but for example, if 2022 did not look like a good time to go out, if we went out in 2023, we would still have work and our program would continue if we were to go out in 2023. So it gives us a little bit of that flexibility to flex back a year with, certainly there would be some changes, but it wouldn't be a significant change from what we're doing. Okay, I will move on. I'm happy to come back to this and answer other questions. And I think when we get into the exercise, we might have some more. Want to move to just quick overview and we'll start to get into the documents. So in your packet, you should have 4 documents. You should have an education and facility improvement summary, a bond budget and sample scenario matrix, the levy rate analysis that was provided, and then a copy of our racial equity and social
I'm just
justice.
listening.
And so we're going to hit on the levy rate analysis first and relatively quickly, but again, please ask questions. So what we did in anticipation of this discussion was we asked our financial advisors to look at 2 possible scenarios, and not that those are the only scenarios, those are just the 2 initial ones we asked them to look at for us. And that's what's in the packet. The first scenario is a $500 million bond, which would be November this year, with an anticipation of a bond in 3 years, which would be for $900 million. And then a $590 million with anticipation of a bond in another 2 years, 2020, also for 900. And that goes back to, again, this idea of that long-term capital plan is still in place. We're just breaking out into these smaller chunks. And what the analysis is fairly long and there's a lot of detail in there, but I think I'll hit what the highlights are. When we talk about maintaining a level levy rate, what we're talking about, so this graph on the left here shows what our current bond obligations are. So this is what we have in place right now with the bonds that we have sold to date, dating back from the 2012 bond authorization. So this $2.50 is the level rate that we are trying to maintain. So the gap, as we look out future years between these obligation rates and that $2.50 per thousand, that is our capacity. And what the analysis has shown with these 2 options is that the idea of a resiliency bond followed by another larger bond is feasible. It's given us 2 options, which are not caps. They're just 2 options. It's really showing us, yes, you could do that. And it doesn't have to be 500. It doesn't have to be 590. It can be more, it can be less. And then the next one, if it's in 2 years or 3 years, it could be up 900 million, or it could be more, it could be less. What's showing is as it fills in this capacity, we have options. And if we were to look for something more, for example, what we would see is the financing of those options would just change here out in the future. It might get longer and have a longer tail and go out future years. But I just think the point is to not focus too much on the specifics, know that we have options. And so this plan is feasible. We just need to figure out exactly what that amount is that we want to go out for right now and decide on that final financing plan. So I'll pause there because I think people have questions about the financing.
So Dan, if you went for, this is Director Brim Edwards, if you went for 4 years, same rate, what's the range of resources that you might have available?
So you're saying if we went 4 years instead of the 2 or 3? I think, is that your question, Director
Yes.
Edwards? Okay. The answer is it's variable because we can vary what the terms of the debt is. So certainly the longer out, the more years, the more it can be. But there isn't a cap. There isn't a hard number that says this is the number and you can't go beyond it. I realize that that's somewhat of a squishy answer. And we can have our financial advisors run different scenarios, but there isn't going to be one specific number.
But like, for example, you've projected out a 500 or a 590 for 2 years. If it was years, your range could be 7 to 900 million. Or you're saying you can make it fit to what without raising the rate.
Yeah, sure. Yes, we can make it fit, and we can provide different financing options to make it fit. Now, of course, there are changes, and what that is the downstream impacts. So how long is your financing model now, and what are those rates as they go forward? And so that is what changes. But yes, largely we can make it fit. We just need to be mindful of what those downstream impacts are.
Dan, I have a question, and I'm not sure if this is the right time to ask it. But if we can contrast the workflow that we would anticipate with an 8-year bond versus a shorter bond, and if we think of the flow of rebuilding high schools, if we pretend like this didn't happen, we are still on track for an 8-year bond, when would we anticipate starting the next high school, starting construction? And how would that differ under a 2-year or 3-year bond followed by a longer bond scenario? And overall, at the end of 8 years, would we be still at the same place because in the follow-up bond we'd really jump into doing that? And again, I realize there's a lot to discuss there, but in your best guess, would this delay our longer term work by a couple of years, or not necessarily, or?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I'll answer it, and part of the answer is it depends, but I'll answer it in this way. So if we were to go with the original plan and we passed a $1.4 billion bond this November, and it contained, one or more high schools, we would be pretty hard pressed to get into construction before 2023. Not that it's impossible, but our planning and design schedules run about 2 years. And we don't have finalized master plans yet on these high schools. So we would need to finish the master planning process and then get into full design. So roughly 2023. If we go out, we have a resiliency bond, and we go out in 2020, that would push probably those high school starts back a little bit, unless we chose to be specific about we want to plan for one or more high schools to start a timeline. Therefore, we want to add some funds into this resiliency bond for that effort. And that's a decision that we can make, but that would be a way to really keep on the same schedule. That said, I think your longer question of, well, if let's just go 8 years out from now, if we do this 2-year and then a 6-year, we might be at the same place 8 years from now or 9 years from now. So I don't think in the long term there's really much of a change, if any change at all, but there's a good likelihood of a pushback from the start for 1 or 2 of the schools.
So here's where I'm coming from. We've all seen what happens when we don't invest in infrastructure on a timely basis and how that's affecting our healthcare. We have long-term needs around our infrastructure, around seismic safety, if nothing else, along with, of course, learning environments and so on, ADA, all those good things. So if this ends up not changing, if we end up more or less in the same place, going with a shorter term and then a longer term bond, if in 8 years we're more or less in the same place, I feel a lot better about being flexible going forward. And that we're still doing what needs to be done to ensure safety and accessible and modern learning environments. So thank you. Your answer makes me feel a little better about exploring options. And as we get more specific, hopefully we can get to a more specific answer to that. Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. Other questions on the financing before we move on? Again, we can always come back again too with more questions.
Dan?
Yes.
This is Julia again. So just in theory, and I may have already covered this, but I just want to make sure to emphasize, just because we set out an increment and we discuss a particular time period, that doesn't stop us from going earlier. So for example, right now for the local options, some on a 5-year local option, we don't necessarily wait for the 5th year, but we go in the 4th year early. So in theory, you could do something like have it be a 3-year bond and go into after 2 years, or a 4-year bond and go in 3 years.
Short answer, yes, absolutely can do that. The identifying the duration of the bond or when you want to go back out for a bond doesn't constrain the construction timelines, nor vice versa. Does the construction timelines constrain when you can go back out for a bond?
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to move along, and again, we're happy to come back here with if there are other questions. Want to switch quickly to a couple more documents where I just want to give a little overview of them before we get into the exercises. Then we'll go over them in detail in the exercises. And that is the educational and facility improvement summary, and then the bond budget and sample scenario document. At our last meeting is when we first presented the improvement summary. We went over that in detail, and we had some subject matter experts speak on each one of those. What we provided tonight is an update of that document, crafted specifically for the smaller resiliency bond. And again, we'll go through what those updates are here in a little bit, but that's sort of the meat and potatoes, if you will, of what these budget options look like. And to be clear, that improvement summary document is what informs the bond budget and that sample scenario. So the same scopes of work with those budget options that are in the summary is exactly what is in the bond budget and the scenario. So you can just think of the one on the left as the detail, the one on the right is sort of the shorthand, but you can hopefully very quickly see the nexus between the two. And so just want to level set that before we go on, and we'll revisit this and get into detail when we start into that board feedback exercise. And with that, I think we will move into this last document and our racial equity and social justice lens exercise. So Danny, I'd like to invite you to come and speak to that item.
Hi, everyone. How are you? I am going to take us through just like a quick exercise where we, prior to answering some of the questions, as you consider options, I wanted to introduce you to some ways to frame data to help us all better understand some of the implications of our work together. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen with you all and take us through a couple of different documents. I believe that folks have access to these documents that I'll be sharing. If you have in your documents, I'm just going to take you through, and hopefully you can see this well enough. I'm going to take you through some background data and some context. The second document will be our racial equity and social justice lens. And then there's a series of maps that I'd like us to consider as we try to visualize some of the data as we answer questions. So there's two maps that look at historic information about our sort of historically underserved student population and sort of like where there's concentrations of those students. We have an overlay of looking at children below the federal poverty level. We'll call this the yellow map, if you will. We also have looking at where there's concentrations of folks with less than a high school diploma. We'll call that the green map. And then our purple map looks at people who don't have health insurance coverage. And then the last map is percentage of students who are attending private school. So we'll come back to those, but I just wanted to set the stage for some information, and hopefully this data visualization will give you a much more textured ability to answer some of the questions in the racial equity social justice lens. So before we get to answering the questions, I wanted to just kind of center us in a couple of the belief statements in the racial equity social justice lens. So on page 2, we start with
Danny.
Yes.
This is Amy. I'm sorry. Can I interrupt you for a second? I think that we did not receive all of those documents. I know we didn't receive all of those maps. And so if people think it might be easier to look at them from an email file on their own screens, you might want to share those with us now so that we have another option beside just your shared screen.
All right.
I don't know if we were assuming that we had them, but we don't have all of those that you just referred to.
Amy, I know there was an email from Roseanne shortly before the meeting with a couple maps. Is it not all the maps? Is that what you're?
No, it's just 2.
Yeah. Okay.
Or if you think it's sufficient to do it, Danny, this way, go ahead. I'm
thinking that as I talk about the beliefs that Roseanne and Kara and Courtney Westling are going to send out that document and those documents with those maps. Is that okay?
Perfect.
All right. Thanks for that interruption. Also, let me know if you have a question. Feel free to interject there. So I wanted to just focus us in on a couple of beliefs before we go into answering the racial equity social justice lens prompts. The first one is this belief in that the district should adopt a student-centered racial equity and social justice focused lens in all decisions. So today we're going to look at data that what we think will impact students. The other thing is the other couple of statements I wanted to read was that we believe all students should have equitable access to enriched opportunities in school. We believe we have a collective responsibility to ensure our schools provide a caring, supportive environment, and school communities should support healthy, positive development of students and help them grow their unique gifts and talents. The other thing I wanted to point out is the statement that says, we believe we are uniquely positioned to affect change broadly across our community because of our role in educating and caring for close to 50,000 Portland children every day. We believe in being courageous and bringing a sense of urgency to this important work. I wanted to ground us in these statements as we think about how the physical environments that we're contemplating, the physical improvements, are set in a context of our larger community that impact our students and therefore our students' learning and social and emotional well-being every day. So I believe that you maybe didn't get this document, but we wanted to kind of start to think about some of what we know, some of the data that we know about loose slate. And so in our community, unfortunately, we know that our students of color are disproportionately impacted by several key things. The COVID response has certainly highlighted that students of color are disproportionately experience the digital divide, both in access to technology tools as well as connectivity. We also know from data that students of color are overrepresented in special education. We also know that students of color and communities of color are disproportionately impacted by violent crimes. And we also know that students of color face greater economic insecurity at higher rates. Families of color have disproportionately less wealth. They face higher unemployment and experience poverty at higher rates and own homes at lower rates. And this economic insecurity places students of color at higher risk for homelessness. So if we think about and ground ourselves in some of that data that we know about disproportionality and our focus on students of color, some of the line of thinking that we might think about going into the bond projects. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. We might sort of consider a couple of statements about the way that we prioritize bond projects and the specific scope of work. So if PPS students and educators rely more on technology to implement distance learning during school closures and stay-at-home orders, then PPS should strategically provide resources to students most impacted by the digital divide. If PPS identified schools in higher crime neighborhoods have outdated security systems, then PPS should prioritize those schools for updates. If PPS invests in physical spaces that meet the special needs of students, then more students of color will be better served in special education. And then if PPS students living in poverty have access to safe and warm learning environments, then students will have the conditions to learn and to do better academically, socially, and emotionally. So that's just kind of some context to think about before we go into answering the lens questions. We just kind of wanted to ground you and think about the physical environment, some of the beliefs that we have, and then let's look at some data. So if we were together, I might propose that we get into groups and have a rich conversation about the maps. But what I'm going to ask you all to do is to take a look at these first two maps, the historically underserved student density. And just notice the location. And these are historical maps. So in the next set of maps, in the colored maps, we're going to have a different way that we're grouping schools. But we just wanted to sort of show where there were concentrations of our historically underserved communities. And also remind you, and certainly Michelle and Scott know about this, the way that our community looks, even as relatively soon as 2015 to 16, probably looks different as we think about how our city has changed and affordability has been exacerbated. We may not have these types of concentrations anymore, and students may be even being pushed out further than the boundaries of PPS. But here's what we have is just kind of a look back of where we have concentrations of historically underserved students. Let you take a look at those, kind of reflect on that one.
And Danny, how old is the map here? You referenced that somewhat. You said it was a historic and that it might have changed since 2015. Is this map older than that? Older than 2015?
Oh, this map is 2015-16 data.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. All right, so the second map.
Danny, is this census data or is this our student enrollment data or?
That is, I have more information about the colored maps. I believe this is probably a combination of, because of our methodology, I believe that this is probably a combination of ACS data and our boundary overlays.
Thank you.
That makes sense because it's 2015 and not like 2011 data, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, it makes sense that's from ACS, not the full census.
That's right.
But also, are you pulling real estate data in here too, or is this just enrollment?
I believe this is likely some combination of enrollment and our boundary and ACS data. The next set of maps are ACS data. But this one is a historic map. I really want to give props to Dan and his team, Dana White and Nikki Nowak and Levi and Sarah Thompson. They, with a lot of encouragement and maybe not as much notice, pulled this data together for us. And so we wanted to just kind of go through this exercise knowing that we can continue to refine and add data layers as the Board of Education considers and maybe even provides input on the type of data that you'd like to see. We just kind of wanted to try this visualization. I'm going to take us into the next map. And so this is a different map. So if you look over here, I'm just going to take us down here and then up again. But if we look at the thing, you'll notice that we are grouping schools by TSI, Title I, and CSI, and Title I only. And then we also have CSI and TSI schools. And basically the redder the map, where you see imagine this is like fire. So the hotter the map, where there's more heat or intensity of red, that means that we have the higher percentage of children who live in households with incomes below the federal poverty level. So we just wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to reflect on this map. And as you think about the physical improvements that you're pondering with a bond, with an investment in the bond, we wanted you to sort of look at sort of where we see poverty and also looking at our schools. I'm sorry, my screen is a little bit wonky, so I'm going to slowly scroll down. All right, I'm going to do the same thing. So it's the same sort of scheme here. So the darker the green means that there's a higher concentration of folks with only a high school diploma or less. And this includes folks with a GED. So the darker the green means that that's where there's more of that higher percentage. And then the coloring of the schools is the same as the prior map. Sorry, I'm going fast, but I just wanted you to take a look at that. You can come back to that as we answer these questions.
So Danny, I'm assuming technically that meant the adult population 25 and older, which is usually how the census portrays educational attainments. Just to clarify.
You're so smart. I believe so. I would go into my inbox, but I'm too embarrassed for you guys to see my unread emails where I could clarify that. But you're probably right. Okay, so this map is looking at folks without health insurance coverage. And so it's the same scheme, higher the percent, darker purple, the higher the percentage, and then the same things. So we're just, hopefully you're starting to think about different trends, think about like the types of improvements that might be needed, think about sort of like how those improvements might impact these different populations, centering it in the experiences of our students of color. All right, and then this map, we thought we would just throw this out there for your consideration. I don't know that any of us is making any statement about this, but this is just looking at where there is a higher percentage of folks who are eligible to be, of school age who are enrolled in private school. And private school, I talked with Sarah, and this is where they're paying tuition, so it excludes like a charter school. So this is something for you to think about.
And Danny, do you know where this data comes from?
This is census data as well, I believe.
Danny, I'm just wondering, share what you think what context this provides us.
I think it's just for me, what I'm hoping that you're doing is you're just sort of like getting a I hope that we're providing you with more information about our city and about the physical environments in which you're pondering improvements in the school.
Well, and I think specifically, I don't know, Julie, if you were getting, because this map about private school is really interesting to me, because it seems like you could draw a couple different distinctions. One, an area with high private school enrollment is most likely a relatively privileged area. And again, I'm making a broad assumption there. But on the other hand, what does that mean for the kids who aren't in private school in that particular area? And are they actually being sort of left behind, right? So it doesn't speak to the kids that we're serving through our public school system. It speaks to the kids who aren't. So anyway, I could make like 3 different, maybe competing equity arguments around that data. So not for today, but I think that's a really interesting one. All of these actually maps are fantastic, Danny. Thank you for sharing them.
They are. I really appreciate this too. And the private school thing is almost, I mean, roughly opposite. Private school, this could be a proxy for income. It could be a proxy for race. Any of these maps could be where we're seeing higher poverty, fewer people insured with health insurance are all a proxy for race.
And I wanted to just clarify in our chat, the fabulous Dana White included that, I think I misspoke and I said it was from 2015. It's 2017 ACS data that were the maps of color, the color maps are from.
And
Okay.
Danny, thank you for clarifying that verbally. And I do just want to remind folks actually not to use the chat feature because not everyone watching can see it. So again, that was just clarifying the 2017 ACS data. So thank you for saying that verbally as well.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, it takes a village for me in these maps. Okay, so now that you have this data, a lot of times, what I want us to kind of like grow as a collective as we answer these questions. A lot of times, I feel like we don't have kind of like a data foundation in which to sort of like answer and really ponder the questions in the equity lens. So what I was hoping that we could do now in our remaining 10 minutes is to kind of go through the questions in the lens and think about going back to this document here. If we think about sort of like these bond projects, right? Like we're sort of making some forward-thinking statements about like a bond that sort of proposes to make investments in safety improvements. It might be able to help. We might be able to do something or to center the experience of students of color who might be attending schools in areas where there might be higher crime rates or less access to certain things, and therefore security upgrades would be able to sort of like help create some opportunity. So I want us to, and as we answer the questions, I thought you could kind of toggle between all of this information here and just kind of start to ask yourself these questions. I think that the lens is best applied when you're contemplating specific decisions. And so I think what we want to I think the decision that we're contemplating here is whether to move forward with a bond or not, and so I would ask us to sort of start with that consideration. And there's still plenty of opportunities to kind of apply this to other decision points. So if the chair doesn't mind, do you mind if we just kind of go through and ask questions, and then I will sort of like take notes in our lens form, but you all have the questions before you. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, I think that's great. And just to be clear, so because I do want to keep on schedule, so we're going to sort of do this for the next 10 minutes or so. Is there a longer? I mean, are you sort of introducing us to the tool, and then we as board members can spend more time with it later? Is that kind of where we're headed with this?
I wish you could see my face because I have such a big smile. That sounds great. I mean, I think that the lens is really an opportunity for us to really sort of like develop our collective muscles. And so the more we use it collectively and individually, I think the stronger we'll be, and we'll be able to be more coherent as a system. So I think why don't we sort of like jump in while the water's warm and answer these collectively, and then as a follow-up, I'll work with our board manager, Roseanne Powell, to see if there's a way where we could kind of collect your individual answers afterwards. Is that okay?
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Okay, so let's go to the question about surfacing any assumptions in the consideration of a bond. So if we look at the first question, any assumptions that come to mind? Don't be shy. We only have 10 minutes.
I think this is Director Lowry. I think one of my assumptions is that a bond would benefit all students equally. And that if we get, like we're talking about curriculum or technology, that would benefit everyone. But I don't know that that's necessarily accurate.
Thank you. That's a great one.
That is a good one.
So I think from my perspective, there would be some things that have sort of universal application that all kids would have access to, but then we'd also recognize historic inequities that are currently exist, and that we would over-index in those areas and regions and types of investments in which there exists a historic inequity already.
Okay.
I think a good example of that, we haven't walked through the specific scenarios and what's included in the proposals for modernization, but the proposal for attention to our special education classrooms, and that they're just physically not set up to meet the needs of our students in there is a really good example of how our equity lens can guide us in decision making on facilities improvements.
Great. Okay. Any other assumptions? We can always come back to the assumptions too. I'm just wondering if the maps, as you saw them, if those sort of like brought to bear, like, oh, I was thinking about the city this way, or I was thinking about the district or schools in a certain way.
So one thing, because of that I look at, is that we've made a number of investments already in a number of schools in North and Inner Northeast, and that we essentially will have one school left in kind of the middle of the donut that's not. And if we make a decision to continue to have some of those schools be schools of choice, both Jefferson and Benson, is that we will likely continue inequities in what's both in building and facilities and access to modernized buildings. I mean, and you can address it either by a bond or some other ways, but we'll have a school in the middle of a whole, but one school not modernized, surrounded by other schools, and the school in the middle, everybody has an option to leave it.
Great. Can I, Julia, I feel like you're a deep thinker. Do you mind if I push back too? I think there's an assumption within your assumption too. Would you mind sort of like exploring, do you think there's an assumption about modernization addressing equity in there?
So there is, because I think it's sort of on two levels. One is just a basic, health and safety. Are the roofs not leaking? Are there not exposed wiring? Are the carpets, like not all soiled and damaged? So that's one layer. And then the other layer is I think there's an assumption, well, if you walk through, Grant or Franklin, and hopefully soon Lincoln and Madison, that you will see, like, it feels like a different learning environment than a 1920s learning environment, which is pretty much what most of our existing buildings are. And so, yeah, I do think it feels, and I think students feel the inequity, but like I say, it's two layers. One sort of just the basic safe structural piece. And then the other is like, do they have an environment in which they can optimize their learning?
Great. Thank you for letting me kind of probe a little bit deeper. Let's go into the next question. This is one I kind of want to go ahead. So how have you intentionally involved stakeholders who are also members of the communities affected by this policy, program, practice, or decision? Is there stakeholder support or opposition to the proposal, and why? So I think for this one, we'll ask. There's clearly an impetus for staff to engage stakeholders, but I guess for this one, I'd encourage you all to think about like your stakeholder engagement as board members, as elected officials. Like, how have you engaged stakeholders?
I'll just say I'm in the midst of just building out a website right now, so I haven't had a real organized way of reaching out to stakeholders. But I'm very close to finishing that work, and so and I plan to be more intentional about that work as well, particularly around the Jefferson cluster, which is close to where I live. And anyway, so yeah, I need to do a better job of reaching out to community members, and haven't up until recently had a real good organized way to do so.
Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate you being really reflective about that, Michelle. Other folks?
Can I just, sorry. This is Rita. I just want to clarify, I think when you say this decision, I think we're actually looking at multiple decisions. One is to go out for a bond at all. Another is when we go out and for how much. And then there's a whole series of other decisions about what would be in a bond package.
You were so wise, Rita. I think that thank you for pointing that out, because it can feel quite like cascading and iterative. I think for tonight, if we just do the first decision that you mentioned is consideration of a bond, yes or no, we can apply that to those other scenarios, because if we try to answer all of them, it becomes too complicated. So I think that you're very wise in recognizing that it can cascade down like that. I think for the purpose of this exercise, we just focus on just the consideration of a bond, yes or no.
Well, then I'll weigh in on that.
Okay, thank you.
We've been talking to stakeholders and community members since at least 2011 about the need for modernization bonds. And I think the response has overwhelmingly been, hell yes, we need this.
Great. Other folks?
This is Dr. Lowry. I'm connected to the Cleveland community, and in fact, after the last article about the bond that was in the newspaper, the PTA leadership reached out and just asked me to come and talk and listen to them as we think about bond. So I hear from them on a pretty regular basis, but I have that weird hybrid relationship of both being a parent and a member of the PTA and on the school board. So needed in that community in a unique perspective.
In those conversations, do you get a sense about support or lack of support or any kind of feedback?
I think they are very just to have a high school update and recognize that both Wilson and Jefferson also need high school update. and that we're living in really strange times. And so definitely support for going out for a bond. They see the need both in their building, but also with the coronavirus, the challenges to doing education in different ways and how unprepared our district is. So there's definitely a sense from the Cleveland community that yes, we need to have a bond. And I think the people I've talked to so far are supportive of doing a resiliency bond, but are concerned about long-term future for not just Cleveland, obviously Cleveland first, because that's where they are, but all 3 high schools, that doesn't somehow get lost in the shuffle.
I find, this is Andrew, I find one of the most remarkable things in these conversations is the fact that the people who are most invested are the ones currently in the schools, but recognizing that they won't be there when these things are done. And that just, it's actually, I kind of find it, it's a great thing, right? To see that these people are saying like, look, I know my kids are going to be, even middle school, parents are saying my kids aren't going to benefit from this, but it's really, really important to do it. They're actually the ones coming to the design committee meeting, to sort of push for these improvements. So I think that says something positive about our community, right? That they're sort of looking out for the next set of parents and children sort of coming through the process. The other thing, Danny, I was going to say that I like about this is, we're asking a question now, but really what's important is to plant this question in our mind, and we're going to talk about community engagement at the end of this meeting, and then really be able to answer this question a month from now, 2 months from now, right? Have we done this work in terms of putting together the right bond package for 2020?
That is an excellent segue. So let's go to the next question, and let's spend 2 minutes on this next question, and then we'll sort of call it a close. But so going out for a bond. So as you look at those maps, and as you think about the set of statements that we looked at before, how does the proposed action expand opportunities for racial equity and social justice? And I want to encourage you to be very specific about which demographic groups are going to be affected. So how will each group be impacted or affected by the decision or action? Are there any potential unintended consequences for groups of populations? And are there strategies in place to mitigate any negative impacts? And I know that we really want to focus on the sort of like experience of students of color. So I'd encourage you in your answers to really be specific about a population of students of color.
This is Director Constam. I just wanted to speak to the technology piece in this respect, because we have this odd moment that we're living in that is really showing us what the digital divide is. And it's not just about getting laptops in the hands of kids, but really digging into Wi-Fi connectivity. I mean, even when we're able to provide hotspots, I've talked to a number of families who have Wi-Fi, but it's weak or it's overused or it just doesn't function well enough when the kids are dependent upon it all day long for their learning. And I think we know when we come out of this that we're going to be in a much more blended learning environment. I think forever, much more integrated use of technology. So I think that is a huge consideration for me here, and that we know it's our historically underserved students and our kids living in poverty all over the district that are most affected by that. And it cuts at the most fundamental aspect of what we're doing here. It limits their ability to engage and learn relative to students who have privilege and who have access to technology. And that's the antithesis of the promise of public education.
Great, thank you.
Can I jump in on that? So a couple of things. I guess I'll limit my comment to this. I think I'm finding it difficult to answer this question because it all depends on what package we end up deciding on. Okay, but in terms of the digital divide, I guess I just want to say I think this is also an opportunity for PPS to look at what are the issues that our students and families are facing. And what among those issues do we share with other entities? So, for example, PPS is responsible for making sure that if we're going to be using digital stuff, that all of our students have a device that they can use to do the work. But I don't think we have sole responsibility over internet access. And I think this is an opportunity for PPS and other districts to start looking at ways to leverage other resources and exert some pressure on other jurisdictions and companies, anybody we can find to exert pressure on, to do a much bigger, much broader expansion of internet access that doesn't come out of our very limited public education budget.
So Rita, I think that's a really good point. And so I think because you're such a big brain, I'm gonna push you a little bit. So if you were going to kind of consider that opportunity and sort of center that consideration for a population of students of color, is there a population that comes to mind? Or that where you have more curiosity and you want to know more about?
You're muted, Rita.
Oh,
Sorry. You mean in terms of the internet access?
uh-huh.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd love to get more information in general. It would be helpful, I think, for us to know where the pockets are where digital access is particularly difficult, and look at what resources are available or not available that we could leverage. But I think this is a systems issue. Okay, where I'm going with this is I think PPS ought to be advocating very strongly for municipal broadband. That's where I go.
Love it.
I agree with that. This is Director DePass, and I completely agree about the municipal broadband. But given that that's not here yet, and you're looking for specific communities, I was sort of waiting for my colleagues to speak up, but we're talking about Black and Brown communities specifically, special ed communities specifically, and our kids that are living in higher poverty areas specifically, and that we know don't have the housing or the tools and the resources to be connected. And so I'm hoping that we're eventually talking about what we can do as a learning community together as a district to address these, not just the digital divide, but we can use the bond to somewhat level the playing field for our most vulnerable students. If we don't do that, we're looking at furthering that gap. If we do that, we've done everything we can to address who we know, specific communities that are being left behind.
This Director, oh, sorry, I thought you were.
Yeah, so I'm done.
Okay. And you implied, and I'm sure you meant to include families whose first language is English as a particular challenge around this. And I agree municipal broadband is a great idea. I also hope we stand in solidarity with our rural brothers and sisters, and I guess while I'm here, non-binary identified friends in rural areas who have very limited resources and broadband access. Sorry, my job's intruding here, but I was just off a call with folks in Klickitat County. And when you're in the gorge, if you're more than a couple of yards off the Columbia River, you don't have broadband access. So this is a national infrastructure issue. But yes, absolutely. It would be great to have some specific data around dead spots and how they, you know, another colored map that shows where our families are, who are or historically underserved families are who don't have broadband access or Wi-Fi access, period.
Well, I just want to thank the board for going through this exercise, and I like the way that you sort of you came to sort of like being more curious about the data, and I think there's certainly a lot of opportunities for not only for staff to kind of share some of our data visualizations with folks, but for us as a system to think about the sort of interplay between centering the experience of our students of color and thinking about sort of like the context of the physical environment that we're proposing to improve, and sort of like how those physical environments are set in the context of the larger city. So I'm gonna apologize for going over.
Excuse me, I have one more quick question, and that's that is there a way to map out by building, I'm guessing, achievement statistics? I know that we have that information, but we don't have it necessarily on a map. And is it possible to map those data points on a map so we can see the interplay between the families that don't have access to health insurance, for instance, or some of those other factors that we're looking at on the maps?
Yeah, I think that as you consider the sort of like layers of decision making and the program and the prioritization, I think that we can continue to support you in providing this type of analysis that looks at the combination of sort of like demographics, student, academic, and well-being, as well as some context about the rest of the city. So I think that's more to come, and I think I'm going to turn it back over. I apologize for going over time, and I'll follow up with our fabulous board manager, Roseanne Powell, to give you an opportunity if you want to share some more of your reflections in the lens for this portion. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, David, no, thanks very much for that presentation.
Andrew,
Yeah,
can I make one final comment looking back? And of course, glass half empty, glass half full. But if you look at the majority of the buildings that we've either modernized or they're under construction or in the works, most of those have high concentrations of historically underserved students. Roosevelt, Franklin, Madison, Kellogg certainly will. Fabian, and so on.
Great. No, and thanks. And I want to sort of reiterate, both the information is great, the maps are really great. And I think as we go through this community engagement process over the next few weeks and couple months, that continuing to put this at the forefront and have those questions constantly sort of before us is going to be really important as we craft the details of this, because I think that's where this is going to be really important in terms of how much we invest in each area, and then even within that, where some of those investments are going to go, I think is where we can see some incredible value out of asking those questions. So thank you for that. Dan, I think we're going to turn it back over to you. And actually, we're only 5 minutes behind schedule, so we're doing all right. Dan, we're going to turn it back to you for board options, right?
That is correct. So we're going to jump right into our next exercise. I'm going to present again. How's that look? People see my screen again?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So, so the second exercise is getting individual board member feedback on a sample scenario that we're going to present. So, overview of the exercise, going back to the very beginning, the meeting objective is obtaining feedback that will inform the community engagement process. 3 primary questions we're looking for feedback on. What is the right size of the bond? What are the board's top priorities? And what specific information would you like to receive from the community during this process? So 2 documents that you have in front of you, the improvement summary and the sample scenario. Staff is going to walk through both of those documents. And then hopefully all of the board members received this morning a shared Google Doc, because we want to use this as the tool of where you'll be able to put in your feedback. We'll obviously, of course, take anything you say, but the tool to share some of that specific feedback as we walk through these materials. And so I want to go over the Google Doc now, because I think as staff talks and presents, you might want to make comments right there and not wait until the end.
Hey, Dan, we got a lot of materials today. Can you remind us who it was that sent it? We got it at the end of the day, but I think there was one, but I can't remember who it came, and I've had so many emails come in.
I think from Dan at 10:20 this morning has a link to the shared document.
Great, thank you, Amy.
Sure.
Yep. And it looks like this guy right here.
Okay.
So quick overview of the document. You'll see in there the sample scenario. So to the best of your ability, please provide the feedback based on that scenario. If that doesn't make sense for your feedback, then of course don't. There's a reason there's 2 different colored boxes. The yellow boxes is where we think that those most align with those questions that we're looking for feedback on that will help inform this engagement. That said, the green boxes are specific to every one of the different priority scopes of work. So if you have other feedback and you want to add something more granular, absolutely feel free to do that as well. And just some sample feedback might be at a high level. You might just say that looks about right, or I think it should be higher or lower priority, or a higher dollar amount or lower dollar amount. You might say, I see the different options. I would pick this option instead of that. Or you might say, I think you're missing a scope of work altogether. I think we should include the scope of work. So all those are samples. And then at the bottom of the document are those specific 3 questions. So if you would put some input into there about specifically those questions, that would be great. And again, feel free as we go into these other documents to add the feedback as we talk through them. So do we need any more prefacing on the Google Doc?
So I have just a question. So
Sure.
Well, it asked us what size of bond we want. It is actually coming up with an answer for us. So like my inclination, with what data I know now, and it could change, but would want to go for a larger bond than 500 to 590. So that's one question. And then the second question is, I don't necessarily see some of these categories. So for example, 127 million for technology, like that's a big number. So it may be like 50 million of it, like, yes, that's, it should be high. That's just right. But like the other piece, that's a lower priority. Mm-hmm. And the things that may be missing altogether as well from this. So I'm wondering how we're supposed to use the sheet in that capacity, because this seems to give us kind of a limited set of options.
And also, Dan, can you direct us? We've seen it, but I don't know how to put my hands on it right now, to the other document that I guess it's in the facilities report that breaks down each of these categories. So like breaks down technology into infrastructure, devices.
So that is a perfect segue into where we're going next. And Don will be talking specifically, he's going to kick us off and specifically talk about that. So I think we'll answer those questions here in just 1 minute. And I think, if I understand, Julia, your initial question about in the scenario, if you think, there's a sample scenario, it's 590 million. If you think that it should be higher, one option you might do is pick some of the categories that you think are too low and say, I think this scope should be a higher priority. And then you might propose a higher amount. You might propose a specific amount, 750 or something, or give a range, or you can kind of be as specific as you want. But that might be a way to provide that feedback. And if there's a desire for more granularity, I'm certain we can work that out. As well.
So are we supposed to be doing like what Director Bailey's doing, which is just dropping in the numbers, or are we supposed to be doing lower, higher, or just right? I'd rather do it Scott's way.
Well, I noticed that I was hoping there would be an additive so I could throw in what I think should be in there and go, okay, 1.7 billion, maybe I have to trim a few things. Sorry, a little tongue in cheek there. But,
I'm going to suggest
I was
maybe
there would be an additive function there.
If I could cut in, so I think we might be being a little too, not granular is the wrong word. You can be granular, but so this is not intended to come up with the answer. I think what staff are looking for is some general feedback. So if you have a number, stick a number in. If you have a direction, stick a direction in. If you have broad comments, throw those on at the bottom. If you want to add a modernization in, put it in the other under modernization. So I think it's flexible enough to just type in there what you're interested in seeing, and then staff can sort of take that as part of an iteration.
I have a question too. This is Director DePass.
I think you just muted yourself, Michelle.
Thank you. How am I supposed to know if 127? I can't even read on the screen there. But for instance, 127 million is too high, too low, or just right. Compared to what? Or are we just giving our sense of this? I don't get it. Or am I missing some background information?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect question. And I think kind of the culmination of those are good questions. And I think Director Scott did a good job of sort of giving the overview of this document is put together because we assumed that some board members would want to go into a little more detail and would say, I would pick this option versus that one. And you're about to see those options in a little more detail. And others might just prefer to say, yeah, that seems about right with what I know. And I see that staff is recommending this or staff is proposing these options. This is what seems right to me. Or if there's an area where you're just not comfortable, you don't feel like you have enough information, don't feel obligated to put that in there. But really the feedback from this is going to be then handed over to our community engagement folks. And they're the smart folks that are going to take that and say, okay, now that we have this information, we're going to craft questions for the community. And some of that will be on what's the total bond amount, but others will be, community, what do you think? Should technology be a high priority? Should it be 10% or 20% of the bond? And should curriculum be a high amount, or should it be more focused on roofs or things like that? So they're going to break out those different pieces as well, but really it's to inform what questions do we go out to the community. So when that information comes back, you'll feel more informed about making a decision on the bond budget.
So under the sample scenario, are those staff, is that hard, are those hard numbers, or how were those numbers gotten?
That's a great question. So all of those numbers are estimates from staff, and we're going to go over that summary document. But if some board members remember back at our last meeting, which I think was March 12th, the document we're about to go over, we're going to go over the changes, but we went over that in detail in March. And I think we spent an hour or maybe more going over every one of those items. So we want to kind of hit the highlights of those again. But these are estimates that are coming from staff for these specific scopes of work. Also, if I had the fun little graph, I would show it here of the cone of uncertainty, as it's called, which really says we're very early on in the planning. These dollar amounts, these estimates, they will change. There's no question that they will change. Some will go up, some will go down. So we're very early on. So these are high level estimates, but yes, they're all derived from staff.
Okay, so I think I'm comparing against itself, not against some future like dollar figure, but basically ranking, I guess, priorities there. I'm going to start to fill it out, and I'll just listen in as those other documents come forth, so we don't take up too much time.
Okay, great. And if your questions aren't answered, please bring them up, and we'll certainly answer those questions. And luckily we brought a bunch of smart people to this meeting, so we can go into details about the specific scope as we walk through it. So I will jump into the next document. I have one more sort of preface document. We're going to talk about the educational facility summary, which feeds this budget and scenario document, which hopefully will give you the information to provide the feedback. So we're going to walk through the summary. I'm not going to try and scroll through it as we go. I'm just going to stop sharing, but we'll hit each section where there are updates from last time. And I think we are going to start with Don, if you are on.
Good evening. Yes, I'm here, Dan. Good evening, directors and Superintendent Guerrero. So to try and, I've been listening very intently and trying to encapsulate all of the feedback that Dan just received, and to include that within the little synopsis that I'm trying to provide and where we're going. But one thing that we have seen, particularly since the outbreak of this COVID, and how we've ended up in a decision of how do we do a short-term bond or a longer-term bond, is how prevalent the digital divide is, and how necessary it is for a lot of our students to be focused on as part of what our next bond effort looks at, and the opportunities it's opened up for us as a school system to take advantage of the real-time professional development and awareness and fear removal of being able to try things using technology and using digital platforms with our staff and with students. So we've got a wonderful opportunity here to answer the needs for our students, as well as take advantage of some real quick learning that our staff have been put through. So the way this $127,500,000 number breaks down, and again, going back to what Dan talked about back in March, was a much larger, more robust number. It falls into four very specific categories. Our core infrastructure, which we utilize every day to do all of our work, to support our buildings, to support the wireless access and the basic internet in our classroom. That is, in this revised effort, comprises $40 million. The third part is device replacement, how we focus on getting devices in students' hands, in our staff's hands, looking to support a one-to-one effort across the system where it makes sense, 312, 212, and making sure that we have the appropriate devices in those lower grades, and grades K2, K3, to make sure that they have the experience and they can take advantage of what technology has to offer. That's, at this point, a $34 million part of that overall budget. We have factored into this plan the technology that was purchased as a result of the emergency situation with COVID. That factors into how we respond with school coming forward, and where we will go in and how we purchase. Part of it gives us a little bit of flexibility in how do we address that internet access divide for staff. We're continuing to have conversations with our partners in the metro, in the city, in the county, on how do we partner, how do we leverage our bandwidth providers to come up with a longer term, more robust response to students that are without. Because it's not just students, it's also our families. It will have an impact on the economy as we try to build that up. Those businesses that have, or those parents that have access, will recover more quickly. So this is a broader term and a larger scope question. Is there some funding where we can partner together and open up some of those opportunities, target those areas, those neighborhoods, with bandwidth from PPS that can serve our folks and our students and our staff, because we have staff that suffer from this as well. The third big category is our classroom modernization. When we talk about modernizing our overall schools, that's great, but the classroom and the environment that students walk in every day, ensuring that they have enhanced access to technology tools, not just a device in their hands, but wireless access that's required. Still, a large number of our schools do not have what we would call instructional wireless. And with the recognition of the divide, how do we provide fence-to-fence wireless? So our campuses, wherever you're at on a campus, for school related, but also in a situation like this, if our Wi-Fi reached outside of our buildings, into our parking lots, into the park areas that most of our schools border, that would provide a much greater access for those students in need in those neighborhoods. ERP comprises a small portion of this. It's about $12.5 million, and that's using a 3 or 4 year run up to get ready for and to build an RFP, to build our skills within our staff, within our human resources, our business offices, our technology offices, to identify what we need, to let an RFP and then transition over to that. So it would lead into the next bond. And the last component of this, which we're asking $15 million for, is the implementation. Our staff can't do all of this work. We can't modernize, we can't upgrade our infrastructure, we can't do all of the device repairs and do our day jobs at the same time. So we'll need contract support to help roll these efforts out, to help make sure that we're doing the right things, that we have people that are attending to the details, attending to the contracts, and making sure that the work happens to meet the needs of our folks. So we have a lot. Yes, sir, Andrew.
This is Andrew on the implementation services. So that's implementation services for all of these infrastructure technology investments, not just for the ERP.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is a little bit of a change, I think, from what we talked about back in February, right? So what you're saying on the ERP is that this would be sort of the run up to it, but it would not be the full cost of implementing a new ERP system.
Correct. That is correct.
Thank you.
The big distinction between what we presented back in early winter and this is, what this doesn't comprise is any of the refresh of the devices or the equipment or the networking gear or the infrastructure that needs to take place in a healthy networking environment. We've pulled that out and we've pushed that off into the next bond effort. So it'd be a much smaller number, but still we have to account for how we refresh networking equipment and all of the components of the technology infrastructure and devices in our staff and our students' hands.
Can you just explain, I think you had a chunk that you said that we've already spent, that we spent just recently. Is that, the devices that we just purchased, would pay for in the bond?
No, that is not my understanding, no.
Okay, so all the new devices that got purchased.
Correct.
For out of current dollars.
Correct.
Okay.
Well,
and request for grant dollars and support dollars, yeah.
But Chromebooks don't have a very long life, right?
Correct.
Right, but I just want to make sure. So right now, we've purchased enough that every student who needs one can have a device.
We've purchased enough for the devices we've checked out. We have enough Chrome devices that we've purchased to fill that need. Yes. So if none of those devices came back, we could replenish those with the ones that we purchased.
And you're proposing 34 million more for additional devices beyond what we just.
Yes, I am. And again, this is a high level number, but we're also including in that where the opportunities to, there is room in that number. This was a number that we presented earlier on. And I've left it because there's unknowns of how many of the devices that we've lent out will come back, what we'll need to use those just to replace those devices, and where are the opportunities for us to partner with our other local municipalities to provide bandwidth, to provide things that are outside of our traditional bandwidth, not in a hotspot, but in a highly amplified Wi-Fi access in targeted neighborhoods around the city. So I didn't peel all of those numbers out of Chromebooks that we've already purchased in this budget figure.
Don, for the folks back home, ERP means?
It's enterprise. I always get the acronyms wrong. Andrew's got it.
It's an enterprise resource planning system.
There we go.
It's what we currently use, PeopleSoft, SAP, all those different types of ERPs.
It does all of our HR and all of our financial work.
Okay, yeah, so yeah, I was going to say real quickly, explain what that means in layperson's language. So that's our basic systems for running the operation.
Yeah.
Second thing is I apologize, I got lost or missed a number. You talked about core infrastructure, 40 million, new devices, 34 million, classroom modernization, what was the number for that?
26 million.
26, that's the one I missed. 12 for the initial, what you call the ERP, and I'm not sure. Offline, if you could clarify in a little more detail how what you're talking about changed, because I don't quite grasp that. And then another
Scott,
15 million to implement.
yeah, Scott, do you have the document? Because this is in the educational facility improvements, the updated May 19th, 2020 document, those dollar amounts.
It was a pretty frenetic day, so I haven't had a chance.
I don't know, they came very late, but I just wanted to, it is in your inbox.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. But again, you know, when we're discussing this publicly, when we go out to get community feedback, it's going to be important to clarify what exactly these things do, what benefits they have, what are the risks of not including this in the bond, so that people can make at least some kind of intelligent, you know, there's always more that's needed than what we can pay for right now. We have a lot of difficult choices to make, but that would help the public as well as us weigh in. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll be happy to follow up with Roseanne with that a little bit clearer explanation of what that piece of this bond work represents.
Great. Dawn, thank you. That was really helpful. I'm going to suggest, because I think we're going to hear from other staff. Is that right, Dan, about the other sections here, the physical facility improvements and capacity?
Correct. We're gonna, yes.
Let's dive into that. Let people go through. I think this is this is actually a fantastic tool. I think it's good as we're doing this, as we go along. I'm thinking that we may want to take a little bit of time as individual board members afterwards as well. But let's get to staff. I'd really like to hear from them about some of the specifics in these things, and we can ask some clarifying questions as well.
Yeah, that's great. And as I think we noted at the very beginning, it definitely is dense, no question. And there's a lot of detail here. And so what we're trying to do tonight is just hit the highlights of changes from March. And so the next one is going to be a curriculum we want to talk about. And I believe Luis is going to talk about the updated options for curriculum. You're on mute, Luis.
Thank you. Good evening, board president, superintendent, board members. First and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to revisit the opportunity to continue to move the work forward in the way that it had been envisioned from its beginning. One of the things that we've learned from the closures of the school is that while the focus continues to be providing equitable access to comprehensive and rigorous learning opportunities for each student, this experience is reminding us how challenging it will be to accomplish. And one of the areas that is foundational to that is the ability to provide the necessary learning resources and teaching resources that students and teachers will need to accomplish that. And so while we did cut back extensively from the initial request, the focus does continue to be on the areas that had been identified through data study, through survey, through just our own understanding of the adoption cycle in Portland, what has been absent in the curriculum cycle at PPS. And so when you look at this list for option A, the areas that really encapsulate when we talk about the whole child. I believe these are a core function of that, which is providing visual and performing arts opportunities for students, addressing the needs of our English language learners, establishing the foundational skills that students have been missing in literacy, and then moving on to the middle school and the high school. One of the things that will be required as a result of that is a comprehensive learning management system for our adults. Again, the learning has been that as we move forward, what is the knowledge base and the skill set that our teachers and site administrators and central office leaders will need to implement our core curriculum. And one is a learning management system that allows for us to provide workshops and services and courses that are either synchronous or asynchronously made available to our teachers and other staff members. Right now, we are using a combination of things from Pepper to Google Classroom to YouTube, and they're all great, but a learning management system allows us to track the learning, to register for that opportunity, and to even begin to offer certificates, badges, etc., which is a way of acknowledging the accomplishment of those adults who've taken the program or that set of courses. The content area that will be the key priority for next year is mathematics, and that is because our math program is pre-Common Core standards and does require a clear refresh. And so we're going to be looking at math K-5, then middle school math, as we look at a math course sequence realignment, and then supplement the work at the high school in mathematics. In science, we are looking at K-5 resources because, as you know, the science program is 23 going on 24 years old. And so it's becoming very difficult to refresh it with gathered materials. So that is one that we are very much looking forward to adopting. Then the social emotional learning, I would like to ask Brenda Martinick if she's on to share a little bit about how, as we look at the instructional core work, that we don't forget and that we do realign the social emotional learning that is critical.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, board and Dan, for the bond committee meeting tonight. We have also included social emotional learning as part of the curriculum work. We realize, especially now with the pandemic that's occurring, that social emotional supports and mental health supports and a learning management system to help progress monitor and help support school climate and engagement for students is crucial. And so what we've also done is included social emotional learning into the bond under the curriculum. This way it'll help tie into all of the work that has to align with our curriculum and instruction materials. So that's the additional piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. And so we rounded out by looking at social sciences, which includes ethnic studies and Indian education are an integral part of the social studies framework that we are hoping to adopt. And then world languages to move from the dual language programs at the elementary school and then into the implementation of world language programs in 6-12. One of the things that has become critical now as we look at the procurement of these resources is the digital footprint that they bring that allow for us to work both in the traditional analog environment, but also in the digital environment. And so the publishers that we are working with and have been working with have been really sensitive to the new need that has emerged to accelerate the need to make the content available in digital format so that we can incorporate it into our platforms and our apps so that both teacher and students have access to them, but also so that the preparation material such as units and lessons can be uploaded onto our Atlas platform that allows for easy access by our teachers and our site administrators. So the estimates include projections for print, digital, and potential intervention resources for the content areas that you see identified. In Plan B, it would be a reduction of some of the resources that we've identified so that it still maintains a focus on the specific areas like math and language arts, but it extends in some of the other areas over a longer period of time, knowing that we will cover those as time and resources become available, given our financial situation at any particular point on that timeline. And so that's where we are with that work. The original in ask was anywhere between 30 at the low end and 41 on the high end. And so we've cut back so that we can focus more clearly and take it deeper with the resources that we are asking for.
Great, thank you, Dr. Valentino. Just to be clear, so in the sort of document we have, you talk about option A at about $29.6 million and option B at about $25.4 million. And then on our sheet, I think where we are is at, I just had it in front of me. It's funny, it doesn't scroll super well, my apologies. I think we have it at just under 25 million. So those are, I mean, that's sort of option B.
Okay.
Is that right? I mean, it's option
yes.
B. No? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Director Scott, I think what you're hearing here is in the same way we believe every student should, when they're attending on campus, they're learning that it's safe, that it's dry, that it's warm. And we have a lot of neglected buildings where the water's coming in, where the boilers aren't working, where security is lacking. And so no one would argue that we're there with all of our campuses. But in the same way that our buildings physically have been neglected, so too, I think you heard a description that our technology infrastructure has been neglected. You know, and as much as we've tried to mitigate during this crisis, handing out devices and supporting internet connectivity, that's just hardware. And without an investment in high quality digital content that's aligned with an equal debt in the curricular side, where investments have also not been made over time, and perhaps out of necessity, you know, that was something that was set aside for a better day, but 2 decades have gone by. And so when we look at all of this discussion through that racial equity lens, imagine being a Native student reading 20-year-old social studies materials. It's probably not very culturally responsive. And so as we make these investments at whatever level the board deliberates, you know, it's an opportunity to leapfrog not just the conditions of our schools, but also sort of the experience and the affirmation and the acceleration that our students who most need those improved conditions to get equitable outcomes. So you know, we could certainly get into, you know, even more details, but I want to make sure that the listening public, and as we tell this story out in the community, is clear that these are not areas that could be ignored. Don didn't go into detail about this, but in the same way we might not be prepared seismically, the board and the public has seen what happens when districts are so susceptible to cyber attacks, the security. As we're embarking on this distance learning, there are far too many holes that make me uncomfortable about how to preserve student safety, data, learning privacy, et cetera. And so we're not going back to the past. So we have to sort of be forward thinking in how we would leverage any level of investment in technology or curriculum content so that students have access to something that's not just standards-based from an academics point of view that you heard Brenda describe, how do we continue to build on their healthy, social emotional growth as well too. And there's a lot of training that will need to happen here with our educators and everyone else who would need to count on some of the learning platforms that we'll need to investigate to find the best fit for our district that we could live with for some long term. Never mind our enterprise systems. That it's miraculous, payroll happens on time, or maybe some of the efficiency in our HR could be improved if we had better systems, et cetera. Go down the line, our budgeting, financial systems as well. So I just want to underline, I know that the board doesn't think this, but there is some level of discretion and a level of investment we think we can accommodate in any immediate bond that we're thinking about, but we won't be able to ignore these areas entirely. And I'll just end by saying, that's just not our opinion as the bureaucrats in PPS. Some of these areas resonate very profoundly for our school leaders and our educators. When they hear we might actually make an investment in math curriculum, you can hear sort of the cheers out there because they've been rubbing two sticks together with really subpar material for our students. And so here's an opportunity to impact everybody. But of course, the type of curriculum that we end up choosing and vetting might also be material that better serves our Black, Native, Brown, EL, and SPED kids as well. So it isn't surprising that they don't have the same access to learning content because that content that they're exposed to was never built for them.
Yeah, thank you, Superintendent. I appreciate those comments. And I think as we do our community engagement, it's going to be important to translate what we're talking about here into those terms. And it's some of it's as simple as as a parent, sometimes you see things that your kid comes home with and you just can't believe how outdated it is. And so it almost being as simple as that's what this is going to fix, right? This is the type of investment that your kid will be bringing home material that seems like it makes sense, right? In 2020.
So I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I have to chime in here. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to say the type of investment that I think most people assume the district is able to make every year, and then are surprised at the fact that both how expensive it is, but also how limited the resources are. And those are the trade-offs we've made. So I think it is an opportunity. Go ahead, Scott.
Okay. So having seen this again over the long term, for 25 years, we've been stealing from buildings to keeping the operations going. When I'm, doddering away in a rest home years from now, drooling uncontrollably, and the big earthquake hits, I want to have a smile on my face, knowing that all our schools are seismically safe. And every time we spend $25, I'm fine with technology in the bond, but to me, a curriculum should come out of operations. Every time we spend $25 million on curriculum, that's a grade school. That's roughly the cost of modernizing a grade school in that ballpark. So we're falling one more school behind in modernization. Of course, the curriculum need is huge. I'm not denying that, but there's other needs as well. And if we ignore that infrastructure, say, well, that's so far in the future, we can kind of push that off. I think that's a mistake.
But Scott, don't you think, just to push back on that, there's a trade-off no matter where you take the money from? And I just want to be clear, it's not that there's $25 million of operating money just sitting around waiting to be spent on curriculum. That would be dozens and dozens of teachers, or it would be administrators, or it would be something else that the district has to cut. There's a good reason why we haven't spent that money on curriculum, because it is also an infrastructure investment that can be put off. So really, I want to be clear, because I think what you're saying is there are all these infrastructure needs. We can't meet them all. You would prioritize buildings over curriculum, but it's not so much a bond versus operating, right? In terms of prioritization, it's
well, to me, there's at least traditionally been a divide of what's capital and what's operating. And to me, the curriculum is operating. That's how I think of it. I wouldn't want to I would want to avoid spending operating money on fixing buildings or roofs, even though we desperately need to do that in a lot of areas. So that's kind of, for what it's worth, that's where I draw the line. And it's not a matter of saying what's important or not important, all important. But I just have seen this nibbling away at the building side of things for years, and it ends up costing us more money in the long run. And I'm going to push against that.
Yeah, two things I want to be clear about. One, it is a capital expense, so I just want to be really clear. It is allowable under GASB as a capital expense, so there is nothing appropriate about including it in a bond. I think that's important to state publicly. But I think the second thing, though, that is important is we clearly have also nibbled away at curriculum. I mean, I don't know if first, we do spend operating money on maintenance, in our buildings, and I think that's a normal part of operating expense. But we haven't had the funding to do this, and we can talk about how if we were at an adequately funded school model, then yeah, we would have bought curriculum out of the operating side, but we're not. And I guess to me, it comes down to I think it's an artificial distinction you're making between whether it's out of a bond or not. If it's allowable in a bond, then the only question becomes which is a higher priority. For me, they're both priorities, but I think there's an opportunity to move both ahead. And I think keeping our kids safe is important. Making sure our kids are learning with modern curriculum is also important. And so if there's a way to do both in this bond, I see that as a good direction to go.
I'm not going to disagree with you. Okay. I'm just saying it's when something's long-term, like the rebuilding our schools is, there's a tendency to say, oh, that's so far off in the future. We can spend this money on what we see as an immediate need. And I think that's a bias that we have. But that bias can have very real consequences in terms of putting off some expenditures that are crucial for, again, not only safety in terms of seismic, but also ADA improvements, quality of classrooms, all those factors are part of education as well. And besides adding to long-term maintenance costs, so that which affects what we spend on teachers. I'll stop there. I've made my point, and again, this is not to say I'm right, you're wrong. That's not. I'm just expressing a point of view that I hope everybody takes into account. Again, not necessarily agreeing with me, but at least thinks a little harder about that.
I think this is exactly the kind of conversation we need to be having, and exactly the kind of conversation that our community wants to have as well.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I totally appreciate the discussion we had at our last time, and I led off with some points of view, and I heard other people's, and I've shifted some of my thinking based on that give and take. And so I want to say thank you to fellow board members, the superintendent and staff, because I think together with this pushing and pulling and hearing from the public, we end up in the best possible place.
The positive forward. This is Director Lowry. I want to say that I think there's a balance to this proposal with 1/3 for modernization, 1/3 for ed improvements, and roughly, not quite fully, 1/3 for the physical infrastructure. So I think, given exactly what you're saying, Director Bailey, about those future long-term needs balanced with sort of our immediacy crisis in some ways, there's definitely like a wisdom to the way this has been structured. And I want to appreciate trying to have that balanced perspective to this bond proposal or bond exercise.
So I just want to point out it's 8 o'clock, and you all know how much I hate when our meetings go over. At the same time, this is a really valuable exercise, and I know we have some staff teed up to continue talking. And I also don't want to shut a board conversation down, because I think this is exactly the point of having this work session is to hear from board members about that. So I'm going to propose that we continue going for a little while. I would like to not go too long. I'm going to start getting distracted by my Twitter feed. But Dan, who else do we have to talk tonight? Are we going to hear hear about the SPED classroom investments?
Well, I think that was a very good conversation, and I think it was sort of apropos for this because the technology and curriculum is really what we want to emphasize, because most of the other scopes haven't really changed very much from last time we talked about it when we spent a considerable amount of time and all the subject matter experts came and talked. So I think I can probably go through the other scopes here myself relatively quickly. If the others who are on here really want to speak, go ahead and yell at the screen. But then if there's questions, we have people who can answer those questions, and then we can cover the scenario quickly, and then see where we are there and what questions haven't been answered. So
Great,
I will share again. Okay, that's not where I wanted to go. So going back to this, the improvement summary document, here are the curriculum options that were just discussed. The special ed classrooms, those options have not changed at all from last time. So kind of a quick primer there is the facilities condition assessment noted that our special ed classrooms were some of our most underperforming spaces. We engaged with our special ed staff, and they prioritized a lot of furniture and equipment. So these are various furniture and equipment options that we could do throughout the district. And we've got 3 different options there. But they have not changed from last time that we met. Our roofing, and I'll lump together our roofing and our mechanical, those are largely a time-based scope of work. So we're looking to do 3 or 4 roofs every year. So the estimates, the options here where you see 2, we're basically saying how much can we stomach in this bond for the total amount. We can do probably, you know, if we look to go 4 a year, we're looking about $71 million. If we have to cut that back to 3 a year, we're looking about $53 million. That's based upon our assessments of what our worst roofs are right now. And what we think our capacity is to complete that work. There's certainly more roofs than that need that, but that's what we think a balanced floor capacity and what can be completed with the dollar amount. Mechanical, similar. We have not done a lot of large mechanical improvements in recent years. It is a critical need. It's something we need to start addressing on a regular basis because it is our number one complaint. We had over 6,000 work orders last year for heat and cooling related issues in our buildings. And we estimate a major mechanical replacement, that could be a number of different things, at about $5 million per major system. So these options are really just how many do we think we can tackle a year? We think we could do as many as 5 in a year, which is probably a little bit ambitious, at least to start. But a lower option would be looking to tackle the 3 of the worst, plus additional. We wouldn't just do the big projects, but you need the big capital to do the big projects. We would also take care of target improvements as well. Our security improvements are the same as when we reviewed them in March. There's really 3 discrete scopes here that we believe are priority scopes. The first one, the $4 million, is replacing all of the classroom locks throughout the district. That is something that we want to take on and that we can achieve for about $4 million. $20 million would be adding surveillance cameras throughout the district, additional surveillance cameras, and roughly 2.5 for upgrading our intrusion, our security alarm systems. Those are all really one bite at the apple scope. So whether it takes 2 years or it takes 4 or 5 years to complete all those, we would look for an authorization to approve that scope, and then we would get it done, and then that scope would be done, and we would look for a reoccurring amount in each bond, like we're probably going to look for roofs and mechanical systems. Our seismic, the only change here is before we had 3 options where we were looking at potentially 9 full seismic retrofits, which I think was about $75 or $76 million. That we don't think that's achievable in a 3 to 4 year span. The bigger option here is 6 schools. That would probably be a challenge as well, but doable in 3 or 4 years. And we're also coupling these seismic improvements while we're doing the roof replacements, because those are two very invasive projects, and it's good to couple those together versus doing them independently if you're going to need to do both of them. And then the taper down option there is looking at three of our smaller schools that we think are going to get roof replacements and also have the ability for a full retrofit. And lastly is our ADA. That also did not change from last time, where we have three options, with the first option being getting the first level of all buildings throughout the district up to code. The second option would be getting multiple schools within every cluster to allow students to remain in the cluster if they don't have accessible schools as their home school. And the last option would be to have just one school from every configuration in every cluster. So I went through those quickly. Let me know if you have questions, but also, of course, you have this document if you want to take some time and ask some questions after the fact. I'll quickly pivot so board members can finish their comments if they would like, to this bond sample scenario. So all those options that we just went through on that previous document are shown here. So the same scopes of work, and then you can see the various options if they have options. This sample scenario totals 590 million and identifies the lowest of all the options. We're not saying we're recommending that. That's just, we built one scenario based upon that. And it just seemed like a good place to start for feedback. So certainly some feedback would be, I'd like to prioritize the special ed classrooms. I think that should be a higher priority. You can give a specific amount. You could say it should be the highest priority or the highest option, or you could just say, I think it should be more, something along those lines. So then you'll see at the bottom again, that totals 590 million. The other one number I want to call out here, and I know some board members picked up on it already, is there's only one line where the other has a number in it. And under the modernizations, we have the amount that we estimate that we need to finish the Benson and the Multiple Pathways projects, but also there's this 5 million for other. And we put that in there just so board members, you can remember that if there's something in here that you don't see, you can add that to your comments. If you say physical education is really important, I think we should put some funds to physical education, or visual performing arts, you can put that in here. The other under modernization is a nod to, if we want to target designing one of the high schools before this bond finishes, so that we could get a running start for a future bond, you could put some funds towards that. I'm not implying that 5 million would fully design a high school, but that's the idea there, is that you could have funds in other categories if the board members would like to propose that. And the last thing I'll say before I stop talking is, in this scenario, there isn't any funds under capacity, and we call that capacity either being new capacity or supporting changing of capacity or enrollment. We're obviously going through a process right now to help us identify where capacity needs to be and how that should be situated. But as of right now, there's been no specific capital projects that have been identified that are necessary to support that. Which isn't to say that there isn't going to be in a year or 2 years, but none have been identified as of right now as a priority from the group that is looking at those options. So with that, I will stop talking and take on any questions that we have, allow everyone to finish their feedback in the document. And then I think we want to at least briefly touch on the community engagement process.
Dan, it looks like the technology line got dropped. At least the Google Doc I'm on. It goes from the MPG building.
Oh, in here?
Oh, maybe it's. If anybody else is seeing it the same way.
I think what you're seeing, because we put some comments in there, Julia, it's scrolling poorly, and so it's a little clunky to use. It's still there, but it's a little clunky.
Yeah.
The lines got condensed.
Yeah,
And-
Julia, if you go ahead and delete those comments, then it should come back to normal.
Stop.
Andrew, just to pick up on something that you said earlier, I know for myself, I'd like to be able to take this tool and be able to refer back to the details that we just walked through. I'm not prepared to complete that right now. I don't know how other people feel.
So why don't I propose this? Because I think Amy, that's a great point. I mean, I think a lot of us have filled in some things on it now, but I think people are going to want to think a little bit about it. And so that document is going to continue to be live, and something that you can put your thoughts into. So let's just keep that open. And I guess let's actually, Dan, if we could segue. Well, yeah, I'd like to segue to the community engagement piece, because I think maybe that will inform when you need board members to finish their comments. I know it's relatively soon because we're planning that engagement. Before we switch that, are there any more very specific comments for Dan on the information?
Yes, but go ahead, Julia.
I was gonna say, I have one that it's just the formatting. I'm wondering if at the very bottom of every column, so like say at the bottom of Director Brimedger's column K, you just have a notes, and then you could do like a cell at a row number and put the notes so that we have the upper part of the document just either numbers or just right, higher or lower, so that we have a place to drop the comments at the very bottom. We can connect them back to a cell, but otherwise it's going to be this massive, hard to read document. So just a process suggestion.
And I'll say two things. One, we went through multiple iterations, and I promise you there is some versions that are much more detailed that we can provide. And I say that for two reasons. One, I might need, if Roseanne Powell is still on, I think there was some concern about having a shared document that all the board members were able to access when we weren't in a meeting. And so if we do need to cut this off, I am happy to provide via email so individually everyone can have that more detailed one. So you can have both. We have this one that we talked about now, and then a more detailed one that you can go through and add more after the meeting. And so
yeah, Dan, that's a great point. As I was saying that, I had that exact thought about how this works from a public meeting standpoint. So you're right, great point. We can work on this in this meeting, but we can't work on it simultaneously outside of the meeting because that would be essentially like a meeting. Dan, why don't you do this? Why don't you send out an Excel version of this to people so it's not a shared Google Doc that people can then use, and you'll find it much easier if you open an Excel sheet on your rather than the Google Doc. That you'll be able to put in your own comments. You can structure it how you want. Send it back to Dan, and that way the staff can then compile all the board comments.
So just as I'm sorry, a further just process piece, we can just if we increase the overall size, we can just take the formula from the admin, the program contingency, and just pull it through so that we pull through accurate 5%, 10% numbers.
Yeah, what we can, when I send out the Excel document, what I'll do is I'll give you multiple options, one for notes and one where you can just put in numbers. So those formulas will work. So board members can choose if they want to do one or the other or both.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think I like the really clean version, just as a way to be able to sort of eyeball the whole thing on a almost a one pager.
Great. Any other quick questions before we do the engagement, Scott?
Yes, Dan, I have two information requests that I think are relatively small dollar numbers. And it has to do with our climate justice sustainability practices. One is, I know we have leaf blowers that are the 2-stroke engine gas powered things that are really terrible on carbon emissions. What would it cost to replace those with non-gasoline sources of power? And there's probably the same kind of two-stroke engine on lawnmowers and maybe some other equipment as well. I don't think that's a huge capital expense, but that's something I'd like for us to consider. A second thing is, and again, this is one of those invest now and reap the returns soon, is around replacing boilers and improving energy efficiency in our buildings. That'll pay for itself within a very short period of time, which we can either use to have lower operating costs. So more teachers, more curriculum through the operating side of the budget, or we could even plow those savings back into the bond and have it be a zero net expenditure over time. Either one sounds good to me. But if there was an option or two around investing in energy efficiency, I'd like to see that. Or is that too onerous? And I know
No.
for the energy efficiency, there's matching or some kind of matching state funds. Lots of opportunities for student engagement around that in terms of project-based CTE.
And we have already currently prioritized a list of the energy improvements, that we're doing now, but the ones that we want to go after with more capital. So I can get that and send that out to the board.
That would be great. And finally, I don't know if anybody's done reflection on where we are in terms of student engagement with both bond planning and project-based learning when we're working on schools, either the repair side or the modernization side, and whether or how we can take it up another notch going forward. I think we're doing some really good stuff, and I think we could also take that up a notch.
Yeah, we can get an update on our student engagement. It's something we do report on quarterly. I don't know where we are at the moment, and we do have annual goals, but I'll get an update to that as well.
Yeah, I think it's worth doing a little cross-sectional piece about how we can, both on the curriculum side, CTE side, take it up another step. Thanks.
Can I ask a couple of things? This is Rita. So I'm going to ask for data, but I think you've already sent it. I'm just asking to get it again, so it's at the top of my inbox. I would like to compare these proposals against the information that I think you've already done, laying out the critical system, the critical systems that are at risk of failing. So, the roof, the mechanical systems, and I'm pretty sure you've already sent that, but it was quite a while ago. And if you have it to hand and could send it to us again, I would appreciate that. Is that doable, Dan?
Yes, absolutely. I will do that.
Okay. And then around the technology, I am totally on board with improving the, infrastructure, technological infrastructure around security and basic systems and all that. I do have a question about to what degree are the requests for technological investments being driven by the pandemic? I guess that I would like to hear from somebody, and I think it would be coming from the instructional side rather than OSM. Kind of what do we imagine would be the role of technology in a post-COVID world? I'm going to going to be optimistic and say there will be a post-COVID world. And I'm curious how we envision instruction will be happening. Are we envisioning that we're going to have much greater use of technology on a normal basis? Or is this kind of the bias of the now? So anyway, if somebody can give me a little information on that, I'd appreciate it. Okay, thank you.
Hi. Yes, I can provide a quick response based on the work that we have been doing. One of the things that the closures have done is that they thrusted us into a wormhole at rapid speed in a way that we will not be able to return from. So we will continue to move forward. That said, what we are looking at upon our reentry is 3 scenarios. One is in-person instruction, but given the accommodations that will be necessary, it would still put us in a hybrid situation where calendars may need to be adjusted, space will need to be adjusted, or we will need to continue, at least for the midterm, to remain in a full virtual learning and teaching environment. Because of that, we've been thinking about, one, what are the practices that will need to be applied using devices, platforms, and applications in supporting students with their learning. It has to look different than it did this spring because, for one, just the grading system has been adjusted. The number of hours on task has been reduced. The amount of time to support and guide teachers has been lessened. And so those things will need to be revisited as we prepare to ensure that we are more robust in how we're addressing that. So the role of technology will be, how will devices become part of the enhanced instructional tool that will support the teaching and learning process? How will we provide professional development inside of the platforms through a learning management system like Canvas or Pepper, or whichever one is decided upon, so that we provide teachers with the necessary professional learning opportunities they will need? And then how are we going to take advantage of the individualized instruction that has become a natural part of the learning experience for many of our students? Many of our teachers are using, to go back to Director Bailey's comment on project-based learning, we have several students who are now working on credit recovery using project-based learning as their model for learning. And then that means that it's a model for the teaching. We're also looking at that as part of the CTE experience moving forward with our students, because now we are seeing that there are students who are thriving with those opportunities. And so that means we need to have the broadband for those students so that they can work at home or in any other setting. So we need to make that available. But a key feature of our work moving forward is that technology is now going to be a permanent part of our teaching and learning practice. So that means that the elements that contribute to the instructional core, which is the teacher, the student, and the content, will be inclusive of a broader role that technology will play. I hope that sort of begins to answer the question.
Yes and no. I guess what I'm asking is in the future, and I don't expect an answer right this very second. But in the future, how are we imagining instruction is going to look, incorporating more technology? I mean, I get it in the short term. Like, no question, we have to do what we can for the next year. But I'm just thinking, these capital bonds are intended to support stuff that is going to last for a very long time. We're building buildings that are going to last for another century. So I need to figure out how to think about the technology in longer term perspective, not just over the next year, but 3 years from now. How are we imagining technology is going to be incorporated? And it's probably a longer answer than you want to give me right now, and that's fine. But I would like to get some insight on that, and I'll tell you why. Because I am not a fan of online learning. I think it's deeply limited. I can see benefit to some hybrid model. I mean, I can see using it to supplement. But, you know, I'm not a Luddite. You know, I appreciate technology, but I guess I'd like some reassurance that we're kind of thinking about this longer term.
So
and you probably are. I just don't know.
I appreciate. I was predicting to myself what you might say about this, Director Moore, because I don't want to give the public the impression that the model we envision in the future, the educational delivery model for our students, that it's, you know, that it's driven by computers and not through the benefit of the professional judgment of our educators. And so there's no substitute for that face-to-face relationship. But we do have to sort of come to terms and acknowledge that there is a role for technology in our schools, you know, as tools, as a way to access content that otherwise might not come in the form of textbooks, for instance. And we would be ill preparing our students if they weren't able to capitalize on using tools in whatever their post-secondary plans are. So it's true, we probably should think beyond the industrial educational model of the last 200 years. If anything, this episode has made it clear we've got to be adaptable and flexible and be able to hop on a platform. And I think some students who have had less interruption these last 8 to 10 weeks is because they had some rehearsed experience with platforms, and they're still engaging with their teachers. But certainly we, like every other district that's really reflecting on this question you're provoking, Director Moore, is, you know, what's the right balance of technology, or I would add, or assessment, or any other sort of important variable in the educational experience of our students. You know, I would also say, what's the right balance of the arts in the educational experience? And that's not, you know, we're not teaching drama, band, or visual art through distance learning necessarily either. And so there's certainly a role for that as well.
I have to say that Director Lowry, with the Cleveland High School band director, Gary Ryler, is knocking it out of the park in teaching band via distance learning. He has provided incredible resources for his students, of which my daughter is one. But I would say that for me, one of the really interesting things is, as this crazy time has given us a chance to say, what if? Like, what could be? What could schools look like? We know that kids need to be with peers and with teachers, but I think, you know, there are some things I like better about Zoom board meetings than I like about in-person board meetings, and there are some things I like better about in-person board meetings than Zoom board meetings. But how do we leverage that for our students in the future? So I think this opens up possibility, because we know that our system doesn't work for everyone. And so how can we use technology, advanced in curriculum, and other pieces to really bring our district forward? So I'm excited about those pieces and the possibility of new methods.
So if I could take a stab at re-asking Director Moore's excellent question in a way that might give us an answer that's short and doable. So imagine 5 years from now, when we finally have a vaccine and we're back to, quote, normal. Sorry, a little snark there. How would a third grade class be the same, and how would it be different? Maybe one example of each. same for 7th grade, same for 10th grade. So that gives us some insight into the thinking without requiring a PhD thesis, and gives us something concrete that we can relate to. That would be my request.
Well, I think we owe everybody sort of our best description of how we might perceive that future. But what I will say, just as an immediate response, is I hope at whatever grade level it is, whatever business we get back to in our schools, that it works a lot better for our Black, Native, Brown, EL, and SPED kids. Because going back to that normal wasn't working for them. So if that means greater access to curriculum, more culturally responsive pedagogy, the use of tools that are technology-based or otherwise, I hope that the educational model we're talking about in the future better serves kids that are on the bottom end, that I know that the board shares and is urgent about, or we wouldn't have outlined these as our goals, that we take this opportunity to reflect on what might we change up so that it better meets their needs.
Here, here.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. It's 8:30. Dan, did we have a little talk about engagement and what comes next? And then that'll help talk about a little bit about how we get to actually the packages that we're going to be engaging the community with.
Yeah, thank you. I think Courtney Wessling is going to hit on what that engagement plan is going to look like, and then some specific next steps.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you everybody for staying on and for this really robust and thoughtful discussion. I really have been learning a lot and really appreciate the dialogue. So yeah, the next steps for engagement, now that we're kind of zeroing in a little bit more, it feels like every time we get the team together, we get a little closer. And it's really helpful to have you all having these discussions, because this is what's helping us to refine how we communicate these options to the community. The timeline right now is that, I think we mentioned at the bond committee meeting, but I don't believe all of you were there. I think Michelle maybe wasn't there. We're working on a number of ways to engage the community. The first is that we're going to launch a survey in multiple languages, and we're shooting for about June 1st. We're going to hold a virtual town hall in early June, and then continue the direct engagement with community members through phone calls. The community can also, we set up an email address, schoolbond@pps.net. So folks don't have to wait for the survey to open up. If they have thoughts and feedback that they want to start sharing, they can do so now. It's live and ready to go if people want to share. So again, I'll say it again, schoolbond@pps.net. And that'll go out in other communications materials. And those are all things that are also being refined right now. Or I guess this conversation will help us move those to the next step to get those ready to go. So we're in that sort of, now what do we do with all this information phase? So we're going to have a lot of meetings over the next few weeks to actually probably the next month and a half to get fodder for the community to look at and contemplate and provide feedback and input. And they may even have more questions than even opinions at this point. We don't know what we're going to hear, which is kind of the beauty of it. So so that's where we are right now. I'm happy to answer any questions. I think Kathleen and Amy are on if there are other questions that maybe I can't answer, but I think we're in a good spot, and this is really helpful.
So I have a question.
Yeah. Well, actually, Julia, just sorry, before you jump in, because I did want to clarify that that's helpful in terms of our next steps. I think one of the things that we do still need to do as a board, we've gathered a lot of information, or we are gathering information tonight, and we need to settle on what we're going to the community with. And we were hoping to get there tonight, but it's okay, we didn't. But I think we need to figure out how we do get there. And I think we need to get there very quickly, like within the next week. So I'm going to loop back with Chair Constam and Vice Chair Moore to sort of talk about what's the next opportunity where the board could come together. What I would ask is that staff take all of this and essentially based on the feedback, sort of develop it into, okay, what would be a couple different options to go to the community with, and then we need to come back to the board with those options so that we as a board, as a full board, can agree that that is in fact what we want to go out to the community with. And we just can't wait very long for that to happen. So we've got to figure out what to happen quickly.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Andrew, because it's really up to you to decide what you want to put forward. We're just hoping to help narrow it and get you thinking about getting to that next step. So this is not the end, but this is really, really the good momentum that we need to get to that next step.
Great. Julia?
Yeah, so I have two things. One, just the survey obviously relies on people having access to, unfortunately, just given the environment we're in, access to the internet and being able to do it electronically. I hope that we are thinking about some ways, just going back to our original part of the discussion tonight, that we're finding ways to solicit feedback from those communities that on the maps show have been historically underserved in a variety of ways. So that's one thing. And then the second is, and I would have jumped in earlier when people were adding kind of their extra pieces, but I'm going to ask again, and I've asked for this for a couple times, but the second middle school in outer Southeast, when we looked at those maps at the very beginning, high levels of poverty, historically underserved students in outer Southeast, and it's the one place where there's a large concentration. So I would ask, Dan, if you can give an estimate on what it would be to convert one of those buildings, Harrison Park most likely, back to a functional middle school, so that kids in outer Southeast have the same things as kids in other quadrants of the city.
Yeah, we can put some numbers together.
Thank you.
Great. Any other closing?
Julia, yes, we are having conversations with the community engagement team, Jonathan, Shanice, to talk about ways to reach folks who may not have easy access to a survey. And we'll work with other staff to reach out to communities that are more challenged in that way.
I mean, I know that the other day, Rita and I participated in a sort of community forum that SEI put on that had, 70 to 80 people on it. And I thought it was a good opportunity to just get a variety of different viewpoints. So if there's some ways to get some focus groups or opportunities other than just filling out a survey or, or one town hall, it'd be great.
Yeah, and I think we can also think about how we distribute paper surveys. And I'm even texting with Margaret Calvert right now about ways to think about this. So this is great.
Good.
Andrew?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
So I'm a little confused by one of your statements. On the one hand, we're trying to get input from the public on what should be in the bond. And you're also saying we need to make up our mind what's in the bond. Which sounds like we make up our mind and we do public process. Help me with the timing on that.
Yeah. No, I think the idea is that I don't think it's very productive to go out to the public with a blank slate and say, what would you like? So we want to narrow that down. And what we've talked about at a couple of the last meetings is narrowing that down to 2 or maybe 3 options. Okay. To go out to sort of say, here are some options. Those aren't hard and fast, right? We're not going to say you have to choose option A, B, or C. We're going to say, here are options. Let's say options A and B. How do those feel? What's missing? What do you want to emphasize? So very similar to what we did tonight to gather that feedback, but having a starting point for them to respond.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, Chair Constam, any final remarks?
Just that everybody should get those comments back, and then we'll figure out how we narrow sort of the scenarios that we want to put forth to the public. But I do think we made some progress tonight.
In the spirit of just, it's so complicated having public meetings in which we don't actually physically have a place. And I'm wondering if we can have on the district landing page, so we can point people to it, both the template that we're going to be using, but also that narrative, so that while we are going to be going out to the broader community with some options, that we have that information available just in the short term somewhere that I say both people can look at how the board members are maybe thinking about it using that template, but also the narrative behind it, just so we're starting to educate and share information with the community.
I think all the documents are already posted, but Courtney, I think you can help to make that a little bit more accessible for people in terms of just pointing to this session and the progress we've made, and making it jump out on the website.
We have some work to do to
under consideration.
Landing page going, but we know it's a priority and it's on the list, the very long list.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the extra time. There is more to come on this. But it is actually a great conversation, and I think we heard a lot of really key things from board members and from staff as well. So thanks for your time, and we will be following up very soon.
And this special meeting of the Board of Education is adjourned.